The crew rowed away from their burning ship as fast as their hands would pull. They knew what was in the hold. They knew they had 10 minutes at most. They reached the far shore, scrambled up the bank, and ran into the woods of Dartmouth screaming warnings in French. Nobody on that side of the harbor understood them. Across the water, in the city of Halifax, 9,000 people did not know what was about to happen to them. They were standing at their windows. They were running toward the waterfront. They were watching the fire. 20 minutes later, the ship exploded with a force of 2.9 kilotons of TNT. It was the largest man-made explosion in human history at the time. It would not be matched until the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima 28 years later. The ship was called the Mont-Blanc. She was a French freighter under Captain Aimé Lemedec, and on the morning of December 6, 1917, she was carrying the worst possible cargo into the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Her holds contained 2,300 tons of picric acid, an unstable yellow chemical used for high explosives. She carried 500 tons of TNT. She carried 10 tons of gun cotton. And on her deck, lashed in steel drums, she carried barrels of benzol, a flammable fuel that vaporizes at room temperature. She had been loaded in New York. She was bound for Bordeaux to deliver munitions to the French army. World War I was in its third winter. The North Atlantic was crawling with German submarines. To survive the crossing, the Mont-Blanc had to join a convoy. To join a convoy, she had to come into Halifax Harbor. The harbor pilot who boarded the Mont-Blanc the night before, a man named Francis Mackey, asked the British naval authorities for special protections. A red warning flag. An escort. A clear lane through the harbor. He was told no. The Mont-Blanc was just another ship in a busy wartime port. By dawn she was waiting at the Narrows, a thin choke point where two ships could only pass each other if they followed the rules. Coming the other direction was the IMO. She was a Norwegian relief ship chartered by the Belgian Relief Commission, carrying humanitarian supplies to German-occupied Europe. Her captain was Hakenfrom. The IMO was running late. She had not finished loading coal the night before. The anti-submarine nets across the harbor had been raised before her bunkering was complete, and she had been forced to wait until morning. This morning, she was in a hurry. She entered the Narrows at high speed. She had already encountered another ship on the wrong side of the channel, and the two had agreed to pass on the wrong side rather than risk a collision. Now she was still on the wrong side when the Mont-Blanc came into view. For a few seconds, the two captains tried to negotiate. Whistles blew. Each ship signaled. Each tried to alter course. And then Captain From of the IMO did something fatal. He ordered his engines reversed. The reverse thrust swung the bow of his ship hard to starboard. It carved a path directly into the side of the Mont-Blanc. The collision was almost gentle. Both ships were moving at little more than walking pace. The IMO's bow struck the Mont-Blanc at the number 1 hold, on the starboard side, just forward of midships. There was a crunch of metal. Steel barrels of benzol on the Mont-Blanc's deck shattered. Fuel poured across her deck and into the hold. As the IMO backed away, sparks from the friction ignited the benzol vapor. The Mont-Blanc was on fire. Captain Lemedec did the math instantly. 2,300 tons of picric acid. 500 tons of TNT. 10 tons of gun cotton. A fire on the deck. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. There was no warning to anyone else. The Mont-Blanc had not flown a red flag. The crew had no time. They climbed into their lifeboats, lowered them into the harbor, and rowed for their lives toward the Dartmouth shore. They reached the bank, scrambled up, and ran into the woods, shouting warnings in French to the people they passed. None of them spoke French. Nobody understood. Nobody warned the city. The Mont-Blanc drifted. With no crew at the helm, the burning ship swung slowly across the Narrows and beached herself against Pier 6, in the heart of the Richmond neighborhood, a working-class district of dockworkers, factory employees, and their families. She lay against the pier, gushing black smoke and 10-meter columns of orange flame. The fire was spectacular. People came to watch. Office workers stood at their windows. School children pressed their faces against the glass. Halifax dockworkers walked down to the waterfront for a closer look. Photographers set up tripods. The Halifax Fire Department arrived and pulled hoses from a hydrant on the pier. Sailors from naval ships in the harbor rowed across to help. A streetcar paused on Barrington Street so passengers could see. Nobody on land knew what was burning. The Mont-Blanc had not flown a red flag. She looked like an ordinary ship on fire, a curiosity, an entertainment. For 20 minutes, between 8:45 and 9:04, the city of Halifax leaned in to watch. Then the picric acid in the hold reached its detonation temperature. At 35 seconds past 9 o'clock on the morning of December 6, 1917, the Mont-Blanc disintegrated. The explosion released the energy of 2.9 kilotons of TNT in a single instant. It was the largest man-made explosion in human history. The shock wave moved outward at the speed of sound, faster than the eye could follow. The harbor floor was exposed. The water was thrown into the air in a column nearly 2 miles high. Some of it came back down as a tsunami wave that swept up the Halifax shore and the Dartmouth shore at the same moment, drowning people who had already survived the blast. The wave reached as high as the second floor of buildings in Richmond. The blast flattened every building within a half-mile of Pier 6. It blew out windows for 10 miles in every direction. The shock could be felt 130 miles away on Cape Breton Island. Pieces of the Mont-Blanc were thrown across the harbor and far beyond. Her half-ton anchor shaft was found 2 miles inland, in the woods. Her cannon was thrown 3 miles north and landed at the bottom of a lake. Inside Richmond, 1,800 people died in the first seconds. 9,000 were injured. 2/3 of the dead and the wounded had been doing what every reasonable person would have done. They had been watching the fire. There was one man in Halifax that morning who knew. His name was Patrick Vincent Coleman. He was 45 years old. He was a railway dispatcher at the Richmond station, 200 yards from Pier 6. A few minutes before the explosion, a sailor from the Mont-Blanc had run past Coleman's office shouting that the burning ship was full of munitions. Coleman knew that the number 10 passenger express from St. John was due to arrive in Halifax at any moment, with 300 passengers on board. Coleman could have run. He had time to run. Instead, he sat back down at his telegraph. He clicked out a message to every station up the line. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. He paused and added one more line. Guess this will be my last message. The number 10 stopped at Rockingham Station, 4 miles north of the city. 300 people were saved. Coleman was killed at his desk. His chief clerk, William Lovett, had stepped outside the building seconds before the blast and was killed too. Coleman left behind a wife, Frances, and 4 children. Frances and their youngest child were in the house just north of the station. They were both seriously injured, but they survived. Frances lived another 53 years. She never remarried. Of the 9,000 injured, the most striking number was a single category. The flying glass from 100,000 shattered windows had blinded an extraordinary number of people. Halifax surgeons performed 249 surgical eye removals in the days that followed. 16 people had both eyes removed. The medical disaster was so unprecedented that Halifax became, in the decade afterward, a world center for ophthalmic surgery. The institute that emerged from those days still exists today. Across the water in Dartmouth, an entire MIKMAC community at Tufts Cove had ceased to exist. In Richmond, every single building within range of the blast was either flattened or burning. The Halifax Protestant Orphanage was gone. The sugar refinery was gone. 3 of the 4 churches in Richmond were gone. So were 2 of its 3 schools. So were almost all of its homes. But the day was not finished. That night, a blizzard hit Halifax. 16 inches of heavy wet snow fell over the wreckage in the next 36 hours. Survivors who had been pinned under collapsed houses froze before rescuers could find them. Children who had been knocked unconscious by the blast woke up buried in snow. The fires that had spread from coal stoves and gas pipes were partially smothered, but so were the cries of the injured. Rescue teams could no longer hear the people they were trying to save. The temperature dropped below zero. The roads vanished. The wounded who had been laid out under tarps in the freight yards had to be carried into whatever buildings still stood. The Chebucto Road School became a temporary morgue, and in its basement, hundreds of bodies were laid in rows for identification. Many were never identified. The blizzard had not just delayed the rescue. It had erased the search. There was one piece of help that was not erased. Within hours of the explosion, the news reached Boston by telegraph. The Massachusetts Public Safety Committee chartered a relief train. Doctors, nurses, surgical equipment, and supplies were loaded that same night. The train left Boston at 10 o'clock. It pushed through the same blizzard that had buried Halifax, sometimes with men walking ahead of the engine to clear drifts. It arrived in Halifax 30 hours later, ahead of any other significant aid. Halifax has never forgotten. Every year, since 1971, the city of Halifax sends a giant Christmas tree to Boston as a thank you. It is set up on Boston Common. The original gesture was made in 1918, and the modern tradition was revived more than 50 years later. It is one of the longest-running expressions of gratitude in North American history. In the years that followed, Halifax tried to understand who was to blame. The first inquiry, hurried and angry, blamed Captain Lemedec of the Mont-Blanc. He was charged with manslaughter. The case fell apart. Then a higher court split the blame between the Mont-Blanc and the IMO. Then the Privy Council in London ruled that both ships were equally at fault, and that the navigational customs of Halifax Harbor had been carelessly enforced for years. The crew of the Mont-Blanc were never punished. They had survived only because they had abandoned a burning ship full of explosives without telling anyone. Captain Lemedec returned to France and continued to command merchant ships for the rest of his career. He never spoke publicly about the explosion again. The Richmond neighborhood was rebuilt under a planner named Thomas Adams. The new district was called the Hydrastone. It was a planned community for the survivors whose homes no longer existed and whose families, in many cases, no longer existed either. It still stands today. If you walk through Halifax now, the explosion is everywhere if you know where to look. There is a memorial bell on Fort Needham, the hill that overlooked Pier 6. The bell tower stands directly above where the Mont-Blanc was burning. There are plaques where Vince Coleman's office once stood. There are pieces of the Mont-Blanc still embedded in cliffs and buildings around the harbor. A fragment of her anchor shaft is mounted at the corner of Spinnaker Drive. The Christmas tree goes to Boston every winter, more than 100 years later. What there is not, in Halifax, is much memory of why the disaster was as bad as it was. The crew rowed away in silence. The harbor pilot's request for a warning flag was denied. The crowd came to watch a fire because nobody had told them what was burning. The cargo was not the disaster. The cargo was waiting to happen. The disaster was a chain of small decisions, a missed deadline, a wrong side of the channel, a denied flag, a panicked reverse, that collapsed into the deadliest accident in Canadian history. If you want to hear about another disaster nobody warned anyone about, where engineers knew the mountain was going to fall and filled the dam anyway, go watch my episode on the Vajan Dam. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. I cover the cases the world forgot.